Good. Let me begin this morning by asking you to imagine that you are Peter or John or James or one of the early disciples. You're probably familiar with the gospel scenes. You're in your boat, you're fishing. Jesus invites you to follow him and be a disciple. And we all know what a disciple is, don't we? A disciple is somebody that wears one of these. Okay, we are learners. We are those on a journey following our Jesus, learning what it means to be his people, carrying and taking responsibility for his mission in the places that he's sent us into. But imagine that you're one of those first disciples, and you've made some pretty big sacrifices. You've left your business. Your whole life now gravitates around following this carpenter turned rabbi, this Jesus of Nazareth, and you're traveling with him. You're on a journey. You're watching the things he does on a daily basis. You're hearing his teaching with your own ears. I mean, what that must have been like. You're witnessing firsthand the extraordinary miracles before your very eyes. You're seeing healing. You're seeing deliverance as he takes spiritual authority over demonic oppression. You're witnessing the multiplication of bread and fish. You maybe even see him walking on the water. Sensing and seeing firsthand his compassion for the broken and the grace that he extends for those on the margins, and hearing the amazing wisdom, the way that he responds to some of those tricky questions and snares that the Pharisees are trying to entangle him in. Having had a serious length of time following Jesus in that way, let me ask you, what would be the one thing that you've seen modeled in the life of Jesus that you would love to learn to do yourself, that you would love to be effective in? What would that one thing be? Maybe it would be preaching. Maybe it would be the wisdom. Maybe it would be the healing. Maybe it would be the deliverance, the authority. Maybe the miracles, the miraculous power. Well, the Gospels only ever record the disciples asking Jesus to teach them to do one thing. We find it in Luke. Lord, teach us to pray, just as John also taught his disciples. And we are, in this season, picking up some of the events in another journey of following, not following Jesus of Nazareth, but following God in the cloud through the wilderness, the journey of Israel. And we are exploring some of their key learning experiences, mindful of the way in which Paul says that these things were actually written down for our instruction as his New Testament people. And we're going to look at one this morning that teaches us all about, I think, learning to pray and the place of prayer. I think that this question, Lord, teach us to pray, comes out of perhaps two things. First of all, the way in which they've seen how prayer is absolutely central in the life of Jesus. Something of a kind of secret, if you like, to all the other stuff. There's something happening in private, an activity that Jesus does away from the eyes of the crowds that is absolutely key to all the miracles and the powerful preaching and the wisdom and the authority over demons. And it's this activity of prayer. They saw firsthand that Jesus was a man of prayer. And I think the other thing that they realize that the question comes out of is just how much they struggle to do this thing called prayer. And I think we can relate to that. You know, when it comes to prayer, all of us are wearing L plates. We feel the struggle of it. It may be even this morning as you've sat there and heard me announce a season of prayer, that inwardly you're almost groaning. Oh, not again. I mean, I've sat through some sermons on prayer. I've been on courses. I've been a Christian so many years, and yet I still feel that I struggle with this activity of prayer. Maybe you're feeling that even this morning. Well, I think the disciples felt that. I think this question, Lord, please teach us how to pray, comes out of that sense of need, that struggle that we can all identify with. And Jesus did teach them to pray. I think this question actually gives us tremendous hope, because it means that we can all learn to pray. Prayer is not something that we are either good at or bad at. It's not something that we're either called to or not called to. Prayer is something we can all learn to grow in. And it's something that we as a church together, as a community, can learn to grow in. I hope that gives you hope. I'm very hopeful as we give a couple of months to particularly focusing on this, that we will come out of those 2 months being more effective in how we pray together as a church community. They grew in prayer. I mean, when Jesus initially invites them to follow him and gathers them around them, they are not a praying community. They're just fishermen. And I guess that for most of us, if not all of us, when we come to Jesus, we don't come to him as great prayer warriors, do we? I mean, some of us, if we're honest, probably most of us, if not all of us, we've never actually ever prayed in our lives. And then we come to Jesus, we hear his call to follow him. We've lived prayerless, independent, self-reliant lives. We've never prayed a prayer in our lives, and then Jesus says, now you come follow me. And one thing I'm going to teach you as my disciple is how to pray. And that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what happened. They see Jesus model it. They recognize the importance of it. They ask him to teach them to do it more effectively. And Jesus does just that. On one occasion, he gives them a framework for the content of their praying. It's called what we call the Lord's Prayer. On other occasions, he tells them stories that underline certain aspects that are really important if we're going to pray effectively. The parable of the nagging widow who keeps coming to the judge for justice. The parable of the friend at midnight who's banging on his neighbor's door in boldness in the middle of the night, making a racket. Jesus tells us those stories because there are important aspects that we need to learn from those stories about what it means to pray effectively. And they learned, and they grew. And guess what? They took on board what they saw modeled and what Jesus taught. And so by the time that we get to the book of Acts, we find they are and have become very much a praying community. After Jesus returns to the Father, they gather, maybe around 120 of them, in the upper room. And what are they doing? They are praying together. And it's into that context the Spirit falls on the day of Pentecost. Acts 2 describes corporate prayer as one of the 4 things as a community that they are devoted to. Acts 4, when Peter and John are arrested, what do? Well, they immediately retreat to Mark's house and they gather to pray together as a church. And again, the Spirit falls, the walls shake. Acts 6 and 7. Deacons are appointed in order that the apostles might spend more time praying and giving themselves to God's word. And throughout Acts we find then a church community that prays frequently together and that is effective in their praying. But they did not begin like that. We can learn how to pray together. And if you're thinking to yourself, oh no, not another sermon on prayer. Or, oh no, not another course on prayer. If corporate prayer is not something that you prioritize, if it's not there in your diary, as it is on our church diary, if it's something that you maybe even avoid because you find it rather awkward to pray with others in a group, and you struggle with that, there is good news. You can learn to pray, and we can learn to pray. We can grow in the frequency and the effectiveness of our praying together, and that's why we are giving a couple of months to learning how to do this better. Now, this is a lifelong learning opportunity journey, isn't it? We're not expecting at the end of 2 months to be there, but we are expecting as we invest and engage with this, every one of us, that we will learn to pray more effectively together. So our passage this morning is going to pick up that theme. It's the story in Acts 17 of Moses up on the mountain raising his staff. This is what the writer of Exodus says. At Rephidim, this is after they've left Egypt, they're on the journey, they're being led by the cloud, and then they get into this place, Rephidim. At Rephidim, Amalek came and fought against Israel, and Moses said to Joshua, select some men for us and go and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand up on the hilltop with God's staff in my hand. And Joshua did as Moses had told him, and he fought against Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. While Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, but whenever he put down his hand, Amalek prevailed. When Moses' hands grew heavy, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat down on it. And then Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until the sun went down. And so Joshua defeated Amalek and his army with the sword. And then the Lord said to Moses, write this down on a scroll as a reminder and recite it to Joshua. I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it, the Lord is my banner. And he said, indeed, my hand is lifted up toward the Lord's throne. The Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. Here on their journey through the wilderness, they have reached this place called Rephidim. It was a region near to Mount Sinai. And at Rephidim, two things happen. First of all, they have a major crisis, an emergency. If you read the passage before this in Exodus 17, you will find this described. They find themselves without any water, and it's a crisis. And Moses is told to strike the rock, and as he does that, water gushes out, and there's enough to hydrate, the 800,000 plus people. So that's one thing that happens. But then on the back of that, they are then attacked by this ruthless people group, the Amalekites. And it's a strange story. And I think whilst there's lots of things we can learn from this, it teaches us something about the place of prayer. It teaches us, first of all, that prayer is pivotal. There's Rephidim, by the way. They've come out of Egypt, headed south, near the region of Mount Sinai. It's a fascinating story, a strange one, isn't it? Moses up on the mountain, raising his staff before the Lord in intercession, and Joshua, meanwhile, down in the valley, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the Amalekites. And what we learn through the story is that there is a direct correlation between what's happening up on the mountain with Moses and what is happening down in the valley in the heat and the thrust of the battle with Joshua. And the message of the story, I think, is very clear. That while both have a place, both intercession and the business of warfare in the context of the Old Testament have their place, the outcome of the battle is decided by what is happening on the mountain. You notice that? Yeah? When the staff comes down, the Amalekites are prevailing. When the staff goes up, Joshua is on the ascendancy and is prevailing. It's a wonderful graphic picture, I think, of the way in which prayerful intercession is pivotal action. The deciding factor is not whether Joshua has enough men in the valley, or whether he's clever enough, or whether his battle strategy is smart enough. The deciding factor is whether Moses is going to press through in intercession on the mountain. It's what Moses is doing up on the mountain that directly influences the outcome of what is happening down there in the valley in the cut and thrust of battle. And the breakthrough that comes is the result of the persistence of Moses in intercession and not the strength of Joshua and his men. It is the staff raised to God and not the sword that is instrumental. And this illustrates for us something that our Western materialism-ridden minds find so difficult to accept and embrace. The power and the mystery of prayer. I mean, on a natural level, this is ridiculous. The Amalekites are closing in, and Moses, the key leader, says to Joshua, "I'll see you later, Joshua." I mean, you get your swords ready, get your men ready, you fight these guys, and I'll see you later. I'm actually just off. You see that mountain over there? I'm going to go off and climb up that mountain. And when I get on the mountain, I'm going to stand there, and I'm going to lift my staff up in the air. That's what I'm going to do. Can you imagine Joshua thinking, what are you on? We need all hands on deck. You're our leader, Moses. We need you in the thick of the battle. There's something of a mystery here that we must get our heads around. If we're honest, we can secretly feel exactly the same way about prayer. That moment in Acts 6, where they appoint 7 men to get on with the practical business of extending the kingdom of God, while the apostles do what? Pray. Oh, great, okay. We'll lay hands on these 7 guys. They're going to do all the work. And what, you apostles now, you're just going to go and you're going to do what? You're going to spend all your time praying and studying the word? Yeah, that's what happens. Prayer is mysterious. Prayer undermines and offends our pride. We just do not and will never, I think, ever understand how it works. And the result is that we are left often with very little confidence in prayer. That is at the heart, I think, of our issue in the West. Up on the mountain, Moses is praying to an invisible God who supernaturally intervenes to bring about outcomes that cannot be explained in material terms. That's the powerful reality of what happens when we pray. Prayer works. We looked at that a few weeks ago at the end of Colossians. And yet it cannot be explained materially or scientifically. You see, our instinct often is to generate and implement a plan of action. We put confidence in planning. We put confidence in action. We implement plans of action rather than inaugurating seasons of prayer, because that's what we feel more comfortable with. We feel more comfortable down in the valley getting on with things than up on the mountain lifting our hands to God in prayer. We think that hands-on action is a better use of our time than hands in the air prayer. Prayer's not our first instinct. It's very often, sadly, our very last resort in life. And the result is prayer becomes a neglected activity in our lives. And prayer meetings become the most neglected part of church life. We may pay lip service to the fact that we believe in prayer, but often our lives and our prayer meetings reflect something very different. And as Keith reminded us, I referred to it some weeks ago, that what we do is what we really believe. And everything else is just religious talk. And you know, when it comes to prayer, often we are nothing more than functional atheists. Grudem says prayer changes the way God acts. C.H. Spurgeon says prayer is the slender nerve that moves the muscle of omnipotence. I love that picture. The power and the potential of muscle is triggered into action through messages sent through tiny, frail nerves. And the muscles respond and are triggered into action. But if those pathways become damaged or they degrade and we develop a neurological disease, we are incapable of recruiting the muscular potential of our bodies. And in the same way, if we neglect prayer, we are left with a powerless church life and a powerless mission. Prayer, Leonard Ravenhill said, is as mighty as God, because he has committed himself to answering it. So it's pivotal. It's pivotal. Prayer is warfare, secondly. This journey through the wilderness that we're looking at, this wasn't a holiday. This wasn't a bunch of tourists, and the cloud was not a tour guide. Neither was it actually even an expedition. I know we talk of it as in terms of an adventure. And there's some truth to that. But it's actually more accurate to describe this journey through the wilderness as a military campaign. We'll touch on this in a couple of weeks. Numbers 10 describes the way that they were organized as they camped together and as they followed the cloud. And this is how Numbers 10 describes it. It says, in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud lifted up above the tabernacle of the testimony. And the Israelites traveled on from the wilderness of Sinai, moving one place to the next until the cloud stopped in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time, according to the Lord's command through Moses, the military divisions of the camp of Judah's descendants, with their banner set out first. And Nashon, son of Amminadab, was over the divisions. And then in verse 28, it says this. It describes these tribal groups. It says that they were military divisions. It says this was the order of march for the Israelites by their military divisions as they set out. So I don't know how you imagine this journey through the wilderness. Well, let me tell you, it's not a bunch of tourists on a very long holiday following a tour guide. Neither is it some wonderful adventure, expedition with an expeditionary leader. This was a highly organized military campaign. In fact, the way that they are organized in their camp was actually a pretty standard way that armies would organize themselves in divisions with their own standard as they embarked on a military campaign. So here at Rephidim, there's a battle that needs to be fought. They're being attacked by the Amalekites. Fairly on in their journey, they're vulnerable. They've experienced, as I said, severe hydration. They are tired. They are weary. And the Amalekites, if you know anything about the Amalekites, they were a brutal enemy. This is what Deuteronomy says. Remember what the Amalekites did along the road while you were coming out of Egypt. How when you were tired and weary, they lay in wait for you. This was an ambush on the road, and they eliminated everyone who was lagging behind. They had no fear of God. I mean, this was a nasty ambush. It was a nasty attack. And the Amalekites were a brutal enemy. They went for Israel when they were at their most vulnerable. They were merciless. They attacked those that were lagging behind, the elderly, the sick, those with children. It was brutal. You know, it's a picture for us of our journey in the Christian life. We have an enemy. We have an enemy. The Bible calls him the enemy of our souls. And I tell you, he is even more merciless and brutal than the Amalekites. He doesn't wait for you to be feeling strong and refreshed in your Christian life before he moves in. No, it's when you're in a challenging season. It's when you're tired. It's when you're exhausted. It's when you're sick. It's when things at work are tough. It's when emotionally your tank is empty or things are confusing in life. And as a result, you are vulnerable. It's when you're becoming a bit detached from the community of the church. Then all hell breaks loose. That's when the ambush happens. This was a critical battle. Israel as a nation were fighting for their survival. I mean, there was the possibility, if they'd have been overcome at this point, they would have been wiped out as a nation, and we'd never hear anything more about the nation of Israel. And so what does Moses do in the light of the battle? He organizes the military divisions under the leadership of Joshua while he gets up on the mountain, and he raises his staff to God in prayer. The whole Exodus from Egypt, the journey through wilderness, is a picture for us of discipleship. Sure, we're familiar with that picture. We're not following the phenomenon of a cloud, are we? But we're following the one in whom all the fullness of the deity dwells, Jesus. He's the one who is the exact representation of God. And just as they left Egypt on the basis of that lamb that was slaughtered, so we have left our old life. We've been delivered. We've been set free. The blood has been shed. But we're not embarking on a holiday when we come to Christ. We're not even, though we do use this language, embarking on a wonderful, great, exciting adventure. What we are doing is we are marching on a military campaign, following a cloud. We're soldiers. It's part of our identity. And whilst the power of Pharaoh has been broken and we've been set free, the battles are far from over. In some senses, actually, it's only when you make that choice and you begin that journey that you find that the battles actually begin. Paul says in Ephesians 6, finally be strengthened by the Lord and by his vast strength, and put on the full armor of God, so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle's not against flesh and blood, it's against rulers, authorities, the cosmic powers of darkness, against evil